Hi, everybody. Welcome to Music, Meaning, and Melodies. Melodies and Meaning. A great pleasure to be here with my friend and colleague of many years to talk about the three books that Ranjit has published last year and one before that. And just to give an idea of what it takes to work in different genres simultaneously. I'd like to start with the Homelands and Ocean, Ranjit's translations of Mir Taqi Mir. In his wide-ranging introduction to this book, there's a passage that describes the deep sense of irretrievable loss and displacement that we experience when our surroundings, the cultural and ecological assumptions that form the basis of our lives, are changed rapidly around us. Is this one of the ways in which Mir speaks to our present?
Well, thank you so much for that. Thanks. Jeet, thank you so much for that question. And again, I'm very moved to be here in Mysuru with this marvelous audience and for us to be talking about our work. And I'm going to talk about your three amazing recent books as well. Continuing a dialogue that goes back to the late 1980s. So it gives one pause. But thank you for your close reading.
Checking. One. Yeah, no, go ahead.
Thank you for your close reading of the Mir book. For me, Mir Taqi Mir resonates very, very strongly because he seems to be such a contemporary figure. He is a refugee, his world is breaking down around him. He has to craft his sense of self and of where he belongs over and over again. And I think that condition of spiritual homelessness, of radical uncertainty, of having to fashion the self, it's as true of his period, the late 18th century, as it is of ours. So I find him extremely congenial, disturbingly congenial, if you will.
Your book takes its title, The Homelands and Ocean, is from couplet number 12 in your selection, which goes, like the whirlpool, still center of a giddy circling, the homelands and ocean that scatters us in all directions, which I think speaks back to what you were just talking about and how relevant this is to our time. Also, I think it has something to do with the contemporaneous nature of the language that you've used.
Absolutely, because in his own time, his language was robustly contemporary. And Urdu was really he didn't even call his language Urdu. He just called it Hindi. It's part of a much larger continuum of languages. And he was making it up as he went along in the most marvelous way. So this very, very strongly resonated for me when he says, Yani vatan darya hai, usme char taraf hai safar mein ab. The idea that the homeland is not only not territorial or terrestrial, but that it's seen in this way, as water, as uncertainty, and that you are cast upon it in some way. I think at a time when we are committing ourselves to very strongly jingoistic, territorial, xenophobic conceptions of where we belong as a nation, it's useful to remind ourselves of this way of thinking about where we stand or where we swim.
Absolutely, yeah. Where we swim, because there's also the idea of water also resonates very much at the moment when we're facing a kind of ecological apocalypse, and which might well arrive by water. So in that sense, the title, Our Homelands and Ocean, works in a couple of ways, including a deeply disturbing portent of the future.
Absolutely, yeah, because it strikes me that we have to look back into the archive of what we inherit, not only to annotate it, but also to be inspired by it. And I think as poets, we're very, very strongly aware of this, which is why I'd like to draw you out, Jeet, on among the 4 or 5 very recent projects that you've been committed to. One of them was the Penguin Book of Indian Poetry in English, and that was also a way of amplifying our framework of what it means to be an Anglophone Indian poet. You've cast your net wide, brought in writers from the diaspora, but also writers from various locations. So could I draw you out on that process?
The title, The Penguin Book of Indian Poets, was a little controversial even before it appeared, because there were poets from other languages who said you should specify in the title that this is Indian poetry in English. But why? The point is, if you call a book the Penguin Book of Indian Poets, and the poets are Indian, in quotes, located all over the world, it's a way of expanding the notion of Indianness and widening it and bringing in all kinds of tangential heritages and legacies and experiences. And I think that really is the power of that book. It makes the local, whether it's in Aarhus or Copenhagen or Bihar, one kind of wave in one singular oceanic movement. Yeah, it was also, I should say that book was a kind of a revelation in a way, because I think even the publishers, Penguin India, was surprised that you could have a book of poems and a fairly hefty 900-page book of poems that was that sold 3 times over. It went into 3 printings, which nobody was expecting. And I don't see why not. You know, publishers love to say that poetry doesn't sell, that people don't buy poetry, which is why we can't publish it. But this is a barefaced lie. Poetry does sell.
Also, as we drove here from Bangalore, it struck both of us that we've been nothing if not industrious, a word that was probably not how we define ourselves 40 years ago. But I'm in great admiration of the way, Jeet, that whilst you're working on your own poetry, you're also working in collaboration with other poets in a jugalbandi. You're also working on the anthology as a form, and you have a novel going on. You have all kinds of projects going, and I think this is probably true of several of us in the sense that our practices are hybrid. But could I draw you out on how this works on an artisanal day-to-day basis for you?
Sure, and I'm going to throw this question right back at you. I think there's this whole idea about, if you write poetry and you write fiction, those are opposing projects, and one doesn't necessarily dovetail into another. But I find that, in fact, in the house that I live in, there are 2 desks in 2 different rooms. And one is the poetry desk and one is the fiction desk. And, I move sometimes between those desks in the space of one day. And invariably, there is a bleed that happens between the various projects that you're working on. Even sometimes subconsciously, you might have a ghost of a line or an image that bleeds into the other thing. And I think that is tremendously positive and a creative kind of impetus. And let me ask you, for instance, the book on Give, which is 6 essays on the poet and painter Give Patel, a friend of Ranjit's for 37 years, and with many connections between you two. You are the interest in painting, in poetry, in a kind of observation of the fissures and delights of Indian society, contemporary Indian society. You were working on that. At the same time, you were working on your poems. You completed your trilogy, and you worked on the Murthy Classical Library, that introduction, and quite a monumental sort of book, and path-breaking in many ways in India. how did those things, did they bleed into each other?
I think, as exactly like you said, these projects or commitments tend to bleed into one another. I've often found that research I'm doing for an essay, let's say, on maritime history, actually haunts me through a line or a figure and then turns into a poem or a prose poem. There was a figure called Siddhi Mubarak Bombay, a 19th century enslaved person in Bombay, who I first discovered in the course of research about the Indian Ocean and its multiple histories. But he just took possession of me in a certain way, and eventually that became a prose poem, which also experiments with linguistic registers.
A prose poem in which book?
It's the first poem in Hunch prose.
Okay,
So the book
go ahead.
opens with this notion of someone who's trying to craft his language. What does it mean to be technically East African, but to be speaking Gujarati? And then to retrieve your sense of who you might be. And then you make up this kaleidoscope of the self. So for me, that's been a model or a metaphor of how we write.
So it's the same subject or figure, but treated in two very different ways. One in a very lyrical and poetic way, and one in a clean, prosaic way.
Yeah, because I think there are, as you do in your own writing, I think there are some forms or genres which allow you to create a rich, receding, amplified sense of background and backdrop, and others where you can focus on the detail until it becomes intense and luminous. But in this book, The Elsewherians, which has just come out, Jeet, I think you actually blur the line between these two scales, if you will. Could you tell us about how you turned towards the memoir form, and how it's about bearing witness to your privacies in a certain way? I mean, which you do as a poet, but this delves right into family history.
Thanks for that. In fact, it bears witness not only to my privacies, but to my parents' privacies, and it's something I've never done before. Kind of deliberately blur the line between family history and fiction. And of course, so I had to ask permission of my parents because they are characters in this book. There are photos of them. They appear under their own names. But they are doing, my father in particular, might be doing things that he might not have done in real life. And that, in fact, when I explained what I was doing and asked permission, my father was quite happy and my mother was not. But there was never any question that she would withhold permission. I think the epigraph that starts this book is something they both believed and continued to believe, and that is when a writer is born into a family, the family is finished. That's a quote by Czesław Milosz. True?
Either finished or discovers afterlives. Because I've found also that in many ways going back into family history really allows us to rethink some of the cliches and platitudes that we might have got caught up with in terms, especially of thinking back over the last 3 centuries. So, but we'll loop to that in a minute. I just want to dwell on the Elsewherians a little more. It's because nomadism, I think, is a major theme that we both share. This also goes back into, in some sense, what used to be described as a sentimental education, an education of the sensibility. Yeah, so do you want to talk about that, about growing up in a variety of locations and how that's shaped your work?
Yeah, my father was a journalist, so we traveled all over the place. He was in Bombay for a while, then he was in Bihar, then we moved to Hong Kong when I was about 9, and then to New York, where he worked with the United Nations, and then back to Hong Kong, then to Bombay, then to Bangalore, and this continued over decades, this kind of life. And I don't know if I would even call it nomadism, or it's a kind of migrancy. But the thing is, each of those places were home. We were never tourists. We would arrive somewhere, and within a matter of a couple of weeks, my mother would know where to shop, she would know where to go, she'd know where we should live. All of that stuff was kind of taken care of. And for example, in Hong Kong, the first thing she learned in Cantonese was the phrase "Kedo China," which means how much. Important and common phrase in Cantonese in Hong Kong and Shanghai, I'm sure, and China. And the thing is, that question, when you ask that to a Chinese merchant or shopkeeper, immediately gives you a certain respect in his eyes. Because you are no longer a tourist, you're no longer a visitor, you live there, and suddenly he looks at you in a different kind of way, and then there's the negotiation, and eventually both parties leave very happy. And this was the story of my childhood and much of my teenage years and early adulthood. And even after we stopped traveling so much, and the family was located in one place, in our case, Bangalore, from 1982 onwards. My parents were in one location. Even then, I kind of continued living in different cities, and I don't consider that any kind of upheaval. Of course, there's a couple of weeks when you're settling into a new house in a new city and you're figuring out where to put items and your books and so on, when it feels a little unsettled. But I think this kind of peripatetic life has left me with one tremendous kind of life lesson, and that is that to be an insider and a city dweller in whichever city it happens to be. And strangely, if I'm even in a new city and I'm kind of standing on a street corner waiting to cross, somebody will come up to me and ask directions. Right. I think maybe some kind of something that shows on the face. I know. Yeah. But you've been in Bombay. In fact, I would like to bring up the poem, very early poem, in which you name streets and lanes of Colaba especially, including very resonant names. For example, Rope Walk Lane, which is still partly there. And it's a kind of a compendium of Bombay street names. But interestingly, although you are a Bombayite, Bombay man, Bombayer, the way that poem is laid out and the streets are named, it is with the eye of the outsider.
And that poem was actually written when I was thousands of miles away in Iowa City, and thinking back to precisely these questions of how we remake ourselves and reshape our lives in different places. But in that poem particularly, I was thinking of a history that was being erased as I wrote. Yeah. The ways in which, for instance, some phases of our history are being stigmatized as evidence of colonialism or whatever it might be, and being overwritten with names that have very little organic resonance to our lives. You know, thinking particularly of Rope Walk Lane, I mean, it comes from a maritime history. It comes from the actual processes by which Bombay, South Bombay, that part of the city, was made. It came out of mercantile exchange. It came out of the coming and going of ships. There was a reality to it. And I've always responded very, very strongly to the sea as natural presence, as something endangered, as a guarantee of creation through exchange, encounter movement. Movement. So. And that's been a theme for me always, having spent so much of my life on the coast. It also fed into this trilogy of books, of poems, which had to do with seeing if we could imagine an atlas of ourselves from the vantage point of the ocean. And what does that look like? And can we still hold on to identities that commit us to being inside citadels? And I think for both of us, I suspect, having been invested so strongly in an island city and a harbor city, that really does something for how we see the world, not through fixities, but through constant mobility.
Absolutely. And it's impossible to live in a city like Bombay and not be aware of water, of the sea, which is always sort of around the corner from wherever you might find yourself in Bombay. The sea is there, the Arabian Sea, a constant looming presence, and it informs your whole sense of belonging in Bombay and your way of looking at Bombay. And I think that's a tremendously fruitful way to locate yourself in a city. And conversely, a city without a river or a sea, Bangalore, for instance. I mean, you have to travel to see a body of water. It again informs the way you live in that location. The river is a idea or presence that begins the Elsewerians and ends it. And to use the old title, a river runs through it. Yes. And there's something about rivers and oceans. You have an ocean in your title that I think it separates us as humans from other parts of the world, but it also connects. And that's how, to talk about maritime history, that's how at one time we moved between cultures and brought spices from India to Arabia, and language, words carried like artifacts of cultural history that took root in some other, and what a richness that is.
It also serves as a talisman, I think, when we remind ourselves, for instance, that the Coromandel Coast actually had connections with the Roman Empire, or when you think of the connections between Goa and the Philippines, you're suddenly seeing your own country as part of these vast global circulations. It's a kind of antidote, or hopefully should be an antidote, to notions of the unique self-consistency of this country, this culture. You see that this culture is actually, it's a mosaic, it's a kaleidoscope. It's made up of things that come from many different sources.
That may not be a extremely popular viewpoint at this point, but it's inescapable, it's inevitable, and absolutely correct. I wanted to just ask you a couple of things about Ice Light, your last book of poems, which is the last in a trilogy of poetry books that occurred within gaps of 3 and 2 years. Particularly about Ice Light. Are we disturbing that conversation? Forgive us. So Ice Light rounds out a trilogy of books published in 3 and 2 year intervals, but it's also informed by the ecological assumptions that are roosting among us like vultures. The book is dedicated to your father, who passed away in 2021, and several individual poems are in memoriam. I was struck by one of them, and I'd like you to talk about that for a little bit. Paishaki.
Oh my God, yes.
Which is one of the several poems in memoriam. It's a kind of an elegy for Kashmir.
It is.
And the last line tells us, "This is the language of my people, the language of living ghosts." I couldn't help but think of Gaza.
Oh God, yes. Yeah, Paishaki is a poem that I worked on for a number of years. It's part of a running thread in my poems, which tend to circle around Kashmir, which is where my people came from in the first place. And that poem is dedicated to Muhammad Subhan Bhagat, who was a great theatre artist, someone who revived the Bhan Prat. It's a robust satirical folk tradition. And unfortunately fell foul both of an oppressive state apparatus, but also a Wahhabi militancy at that point. So the Bhans actually had their instruments broken in public, and Subhan Bhagat literally died of silence. I mean, he was confined to his home by the militants, and not permitted to perform. And that literally killed him. I mean, it struck me as being a fate that awaits artists who face repression. So this turned it as often happens with poems. It came together with this notion of Paishachi, which is literally the language of the ghosts or the demons, which was a placeholder in early linguistics. It was said to be a precursor language to Kashmiri. Today we know that that is untrue, but it served me well as a metaphor to think about what does it mean when you have to conjure up a new language under repression through silence.
A kind of a found metaphor or a received metaphor, this artist who dies of silence and the language of ghosts.
Absolutely, yeah.
Would you like to read a poem from Iceland?
I could. I was
Or
going
did
to
you-
ask you about the city under the
Oh,
city.
sure.
Because I think that dovetails, because the opposite of silence is conviviality, it's collegiality. And I was very, very struck by this project that obviously emerged during the pandemic, did it? The City Under the City, where you and John Kinsella exchanged poems. It's a magical way of tapping into each other's imagination and keeping up this garland of poetic utterances. It kind of reminds us of early days when, in Lavinia Greenlaw's phrase, the news traveled slowly. And you had to imagine what was going on in the mind of a friend or a colleague without direct physical contact. So do you want to tell us about...
I had seen John Kinsella once at a reading that he was giving in Boston. This would have been in around 2002 or thereabouts. And I didn't speak to him, but I saw him read, and I thought he was eccentric, at least, because he read very, very fast, and he kind of walked is too sedate a word. He rushed through the audience while he's reading these poems at a manic speed, and it was just it just struck me because it was the exact opposite of what Indian poets do. In fact, a lot of American poets wouldn't do that. You know, you stand at a podium or you sit and you read sedately. He was the exact opposite of that. Australian poet, kind of transplanted all over the world, and then around the beginning of the pandemic, I got an email out of the blue from Kinsella saying, would you like to collaborate on a book of poems? Back and forth kind of book of poems. It took me about 5 minutes to say yes. And because we were all confined in our homes at that time, I think that lent a sense of urgency and connection and desperation and friendship to this book. Yeah, I think... yeah, it's also a record of those couple of years, I think.
Because so much came out of that period. There was great anguish and grief and suffering during the pandemic. But also it opened up these possibilities of focusing on what is truly important. Yeah, this is really a testament to that, the city under the city.
Thank you so much.
Would you like to read, Jeet? Maybe we can... should we segue into a reading?
Let's do that.
Yeah. So would you read from...
Sure.
And then I'll read from Iceland.
Actually, I was thinking I'd like to read a ghazal in honor of Aga Shahid Ali, who I know you also were a reader of, and you've mentioned him many times. A ghazal that resonates differently today. And it also speaks of water in the first couplet. Yeah. Who among us will escape the hand of water? No cheek, no eye is dry in the land of water. Bolt tight the windows, the wind is fierce tonight. Read the collected works unsigned of water. Tomorrow, my love, we'll walk our bereaved city. We'll see what the streets understand of water. Last night, The moon said your love would abide. How wet are your eyes with the brand of water. Someone is singing a widower's song in Malayalam. I'm reaching for your hair, beribboned of water. When the starlings return to the streets of Manhattan, wake me. Till then am I a man, unmanned of water. In the almanac of rain, you will find all my lines, each rhyme and refrain, each ampersand of water. Jeet, meet Shahid, your guide to the future. He'll teach you to play a baby grand of water. Thank you very much.
And Shahid always used to say that what he missed in an Anglophone reading context was people going, wah, wah. And he would say, why do people sit around in such a funereal manner? but, but it's great to think back to poets who've been so important to us growing up. But I'll read Paishachi, continuing with the Kashmir motif and also certain choices of shaping. Paishachi, in memoriam Muhammad Subhan Bhagat. Who's there, I ask? Unknown hands have rifled through my notes. Not me, says the lamplighter. I can't read the language of ghosts. Pausing in their lullabies, the village women tell me no one's home. They've gone to hunt or be hunted, wearing the iron shrouds of ghosts. I could try and find them who should fear them the most. They whisper in foreign accents, trained in the tactics of ghosts. Our grandfather sits alone. Around his fire, deer, bears, wolves listen as he sings into the dark, doing the treble voices of ghosts. They'll need more fur, more teeth, more claws to act on his boasts. He calls up battle, flight, and death, the circular memories of ghosts. In gusts, bursts, and torrents, Gunadhya's stories will flood the ocean. He chants in a forgotten tongue, growling the vowels of ghosts. His words sound like nothing that guests have ever spoken to hosts. This is the language of my people, the language of living ghosts.
I think we... Another reading? Or we have 10 minutes left, so...
Would you read a poem and then I read?
Yes, yes. This is called Everywhere Is. Whatever you say or don't say, however much you give or withhold your love, the city opens itself to me. It says, come in. Everything you see is yours. The black sky and its painted stars, the particulate matter crowding the air, cars that trumpet their anger at the trees, anger most of all. When I climb down the stairwell and wash at the tiny sink in the corner and make my one good meal of the day, I am so full of gratitude I cannot speak. Everywhere is sweetness, the sound of water flowing into a cavern where I hear a voice speaking Aramaic. I save the best words for you. Thank you.
I'll read a poem called Haji Ali from Hunch Prose. Has to do with what used until very recently to be a major punctuation in Bombay's cartography, which was the island shrine of Haji Ali, which the recent coastal road has completely obscured now, which I think is not only an infrastructural but also a political decision. So, Haji Ali. You wouldn't remember me. I came and went like rain out of season. At Haji Ali, the stoplights changed without recording my passage. I stumbled along the beach, the sea snapping at my heels, guardian angel of the weather with one wing broken. I couldn't stop summer when it prowled and roared in streets that should have been flooded. Every screen in every movie hall was set to zero or lower. I couldn't push back the tide when it washed over the narrow road pointing to the Saints' Island. All I could do when I left was to gather up and carry every one of your boats away. They're riding at anchor in this song you've been trying to remember.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeet.
We have 5 minutes. If we have questions, or if you have questions, please, now is the time.
Good afternoon, sirs. English now serves as a medium for you to propagate your ideas, am I right? Have you ever found it inadequate? You know, have you ever found yourself in a situation wherein you couldn't express something you truly felt?
No.
No. Double no.
Thank you so much.
Mr. Iyer, you had a question?
I wonder if you could answer a question that has long preoccupied me. Are poets born or are they made?
Poets must be born because you need a certain kind of, I don't want to use the word insanity, but I think I will. You do need a certain kind of insanity to choose a career and a vocation that makes absolutely no money. In fact, that might drain money that you do make in other more legitimate avenues, and to pursue that from a young age, in my case from the age of about 14, until the end of your life. And the thing about poetry is once you get that sense when you complete a poem, that sense that you've done this often in a burst, but perhaps rewritten over many weeks and months even. But when you see that and you get that sense of something like power in your fingers as you're working on it, there's nothing that equals that sensation in normal or daily life.
Reminds me of something Dom used to say, Dom Moraes, that there was a certain tingling in the fingers that he felt when he felt a poem coming on. Yeah. But to respond to the question, I think there might be room to think about something between being born and being made, which is being nourished. And I think it's been crucial to many of us to have had early exposure to multiple art forms, to just the fact that culture was seen to be important and not an optional extra. I think there were blessings that we take for granted as we go along, but just the fact that you grew up listening to music or going to exhibitions or having books around you, and where books or reading was not seen as an instrumental, but a spiritually necessary activity. We take these things for granted, but I think this is all very crucial.
I think necessary is the word, because as you were describing a life where you grow up with art, I immediately heard a voice, a contemporary young voice in my head saying privilege. Indeed. In a derogatory sort of way. But the thing is, this is not privilege. This is necessity. And without it, I personally would find it very difficult to sustain an interest in life, you know.
One part of my life has to do with teaching or imagining curricula and so on. And increasingly, I've wondered how to translate this happenstance of birth and privilege, if you want to call it that, and how to turn that into a model that might be widely available. So I think there's also room to think about how, as you said, it's not privilege, it is something that should be available. But how do you translate that into something that is wider than just a class or a milieu?
On our way here to Mysore, you were telling me the story of Swaminathan and the way he, at Bharat Bhavan in Bhopal, one day came across a boy who was painting, and he saw something in that kid and saw a talent waiting to be nurtured, and he did.
This was Jangar Singh Sham. And Swaminathan, who was an artist and an ideologue and an agitator, was also a great institution builder. And he really wandered out into Madhya Pradesh, went into communities that had no privilege at all, the opposite, if anything, and looked for people who had children who had talent, or young people. In one case, Buribai, who actually came to Bharat Bhavan as a construction worker, and he saw a spark there, and today she's a major artist. So it also has to do with this infrastructure of encouragement and generosity and being open to possibility.
Which absolutely gives the lie to the accusation of privilege.
It's a very parliamentary approach.
It's particularly Ranjit that I'm addressing. Your voice, when you recite poetry, is distinctly different to the voice in which you normally speak. Is it the words that impress themselves into memories, into melody, or is it that you are trying desperately to get the audience to understand what is written through the word, through the manner in which you recite it?
I think we're all always desperately trying to get other people to understand what we're saying. But the reason for that difference in voice, the so-called reading voice, I think it indicates a kind of gear shift. Because you're moving to a register where there is cadence, there is a certain musicality, there are pauses that might be irregular to how one normally speaks, and it's just signaling another kind of sonic space that you're entering. It's not so different from listening to a musician. I mean, a musician also makes that shift. I think music and musicality have been crucial. I think those were actually my entry points into poetry as a child. My earliest memories of art are of music on a Garrod turntable at home. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, also the idea of the bardic utterance. Yes. You do shift registers, you do change gears between prose and poetry, as you should. And the musicality of poetry and all the tools that poets have had at hand for ever since poetry was invented as an art form. And I'm talking about meter, about rhyme, about a certain cadence that repeats itself across stanzas, the repetitions that happen, the way forms have lasted the sonnet form has lasted for 500 years. And a sonnet is another word for a songlet. I think that's where the word sonnet came from. The musicality of it. How can you read a sonnet in the normal voice? I think. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming.
Thank you all.